So my name is Andrews. I'm the Hierophant for the Church of Witchcraft. Basically, I make sure everything stays on the rails and doesn't fly too off course, basically. Um, Hierarchy is not super critical, but it is helpful for keeping things going. That role has given me a lot of opportunity to speak with a lot of people and also host these things. So I practice celestial witchcraft, a lot of astrology stuff, planet-based stuff, working with that aspect of things. Really, I kind of focus on the horned lunar regent or horned lunar god, that aspect of it, and I can expand on that if anybody has any questions. Otherwise, thank you for being here, wherever you may be watching this from, whether it's YouTube or something in the future. Thank you for watching, of course. And as always, feel free to connect with us on our Discord. That's going to be where we're mostly active, so we have a lot of different conversations, and you can visit for the SPOTs as well. We have them in Colorado Springs and in Denver. We have them twice a month, and often we have a sermon once a month as well. We missed last month because it was hectic time. So it's nice to be back and actually having a conversation again. Tonight we'll be talking about altars, part 2. This is slightly confusing in my own notes. The YouTube has it listed, has an altars video listed. It is also self-sanctity, I found out through my notes and trying to discern what it is, but self-sanctity also incorporated altars in part. Today I'm going to focus primarily just on the altars aspect, which is why we have a second part, and you can see some of the furniture we're going to be talking about as well behind me, which kind of prompted some of this thought process about altars and adding in more information, because as experience goes on, new information is learned. I encourage people to interact and they can speak and stuff. I don't just need to yammer you for an hour. I'm sure you can figure out how to raise your hand. I'll see the screen and then I can change over and introduce that, or you can add that in the chat on the side. I also have that available, so I'm also watching that. Keep in mind that chat is only for this time that it was recorded, and I'm not going to get that chat elsewhere. It's only for this localized event. So the previous altars video, like I said, it has to do with self-sanctity, and we'll be talking about various major points that I kind of brought up from there. One of those major points is the tangled nest. It's basically centering the self for your own practice. So the tangled nest is referencing basically disruptions or disturbances in your own life, whether that's a physical thing or a metaphysical thing, it really doesn't matter. But that is where we're trying to undo and unbind those things from ourselves so that we can be focused and centered. I find that previously I had, when logic and reason sort of failed me, or at least stopped being enough to resolve situations for me, I thought, you know what, why don't we go ahead and try a faith-based approach? And so I started relying on my witchcraft practice for that aspect. And that re-centered me to where I need to be. Our altars are similar for part of that aspect of centering and undoing that tangled nest. For my own practice, it certainly was highly important for me to access my altar, as well as connect with the celestial liminal realm that I work with from an altar, and that really kind of jump-started what I do. When you deal with this tangled nest, it manages your anxiety, and it can also increase your uncertainty. And managing your anxiety is one of those important things, because if you're distracted by the outside world or all of the things that are going on, it's going to be really difficult for you to do anything with your occult technologies. That is referencing things that are in the divination realm or spellcraft or whatever form those come in. If you're anxious about outside stuff, you might not want to practice that specific thing or engage in that practice. It sometimes can go awry in a lot of different ways, whether that's a message that doesn't get received, and that seems to be where I get most of that, is the receptiveness is hampered by my own turbulence, basically. And the more that I have that anxiety managed, I'm able to be in a more receptive space, and I can hear more of those things around me. You can reference some of the basic skills of witchcraft that I was talking about in this, where we talk about the eyes of a witch, about observation, the hands of a witch, the things that we create, and the eyes of the heart of a witch, which is that connecting space. those pieces are really important. And if we're anxious or upset, or we have these kinds of difficulties in our lives, those things become way harder. They become secondary, especially when you're in things like survival mode. So difficult situations, home life, work life, can really contribute to that disruption. And that's all part of that tangled mess. At the point of working with altars, and really even without an altar, it doesn't really kind of matter, but meditation or prayer are often used at an altar or focal point. Those become your own sacred space. I'll reference those sacred spaces as well. You can hear way more about that in the self-sanctity video, so titled the YouTube altars. And that one will also go over some of that self-sanctity things, that what is sacred, what is important to you. And that brings us to sacred spaces in general. Charming versus enchanting is where I sort of go to this. So an enchantment just reverses this conversation. There's a lot of ways to approach what these two words mean. And I'm using, of course, a very English sort of focused point. And with that, charming and enchanting, when I'm using them in the terms of this particular presentation, a charm is a short-term activity, usually centered on an object of some kind, and that is going to be like a ring, a necklace. It's going to be temporary, likely, or not as long-lived. I've had some debate back and forth about enchantment with my coven, but enchanting is going to be understood, at least in this context, that it's a broad form, long-term enchantment. So that also pertains to sacred spaces, such as chapels like this one, or the house that you live in, or any of the natural elements that you might be involved with. And so those are enchanted areas, and something that isn't inherently sacred, such as a location, can be enchanted for future working. Druids, you'll see this often too, where they'll have a sacred grove, and the workings that they do inherently enchant the area. Nature lends itself well to these already sort of nexus points where we meet up with these enchanted liminal realms, basically. Caves, mountains, seas, rivers, elemental locations. Since most of us here are in Colorado, I'm in Nebraska, but that still stands. Mountains are very sacred. The Dene is one that I referenced as well. They are an indigenous people of this continent, and they have a sacred mountain which has its own entity, its own being, basically, and it is sacred and would, in my terms, be enchanted in that way. Hinges are another one. Henges. Hinges such as Stonehenge, other buried hinges, are all places that are focal points of that sacred energy, of the stuff that we make manifest into those sacred spaces. The Cornish wheel talks about different roads and crossroads, and by that Cornish wheel, I'm talking about the hare, the toad, the raven, the snake, that sort of stuff. And they work with, colloquially, let's call them ley lines. They consider them energy lines, but that colloquial term of ley lines is about the way that I understand how they're referencing those. But another sacred space that's really important, and especially for the Church of Witchcraft, we view the first altar as your first most sacred space. And the first altar is the altar of self. I don't know how many times I can say this. I'm going to be saying this for eternity, or at least until I'm buried or done with this position.
And even afterward, you'll be saying it with a Ouija board.
With a Ouija board, yeah. The first altar is the altar of self, and it is the most sacred component because furniture and items and objects and tools and all of that kind of thing is wonderful to have, and they're great for focus, but not all witches use them, not all practices use them, and centrally for manifesting, we are doing that from our first altar. A witch takes in things from a liminal realm, of which we could go ad nauseum for how many liminal realms there are, but suffice to say things like the celestial or the fairy realm or whatever you want to call it. That liminal realm is something that we take into ourselves, manifest or reconfigure, and then use to our own purposes to formulate into something else, right? To manifest into will, essentially. That can be done in a number of ways. The ceremonies and rituals all vary, the words vary, the entities vary, but that seems to be the most critical component of what witches do, and it sets us apart from other practices. And so with that, the first altar is the sacred space of ourselves. And so that is something to also consider. And that's where that tangled nest comes in, because if your first altar is discombobulated with a bunch of frenetic things, your ability to manifest and channel and focus on what you're doing is going to be very disjointed, more often than not. And it can cause less than desirable results, missed messages, lack of connection. If you are into the deity practice of deities or work with deities, it can be disrespectful to them because you're being disrespectful to yourself. It can vary widely, but in general, when I don't feel like I want to practice or I don't feel stable, I just won't. And it's good to take that step back. In the church also, we've seen a lot of our members have waxing and waning phases in their lives as well. And so their practice will wax and wane with time, not just what's going on in your life. And so minding that is going to be helpful for you when you're centering yourself and trying to undo that tangle nest, and be aware of when you're most healthy or at your waxing point versus your waning point. Right now I'm entering into my waning phase because it's going to start going into daylight, warm things, and that's not my bag. I can work with it occasionally, I will, but try it. Try and see what you're doing, what ends up different for you. If you try and do things in the waxing phase or the waning phase of your power, whatever that is, experiment. I'm not saying don't do it, just be aware that there's going to be mixed results, I suppose you could say. I'm actually on track with times. So expanding on these sacred spaces, we talked a little bit about that first altar. One thing you also want to consider is what is sacred and why is it sacred? Is it sacred because of an entity or deity? And by entity, it's just incorporating all deities, all metaphysical, this other extraplanar entities, right, of any kind. So is something sacred because it's imbued with that, because it has become like an egregore into its own manifested sort of reality, its own personality, its own being, its own type of consciousness? And is it sacred because of that reason? Is it sacred because of history? Why is it sacred to you? I will consistently refer back to Emil Durkheim, and he talks to the behaviorism person, and basically he's saying that our activities are what makes things sacred. If I have two of the same exact object, one can be sacred and one can be profane. Profane just being not sacred. The only reason these two have any difference between them is because a group of people collectively said that one is sacred and the other one isn't. And then they kept reinforcing that belief in that particular object. And by belief, it's just their own group truth. It may very well be comprised of an entity or an egregore or something else that it has in it, but knowing why something is sacred and what it means in your own practice has merit. Because if we don't know why something is sacred, it's hard for us to really know how to interact or engage with our environments and with these liminal realms and that kind of thing. Altar constructs. We talk generally they're about lensing and magnifying is where I see the function of altars primarily. So by lensing, it is the same thing as using a magnifying glass with the sun, right? You're focusing it into a very consistent point and it's going somewhere. It's going to cause fire. If you use a magnifying glass and focus sunlight, you get fire, depending on what you're lighting on fire or pointing it at, right? And so that same lensing effect happens with altars as well. Magnifying is a place where it's basically an expansion or a growth or something along those lines. Use whatever thesaurus word you want to use, but essentially you're blossoming that into something more than what you started with. And that's where that first altar comes into being, because if I'm taking in things from a liminal realm and then I'm reconfiguring them, I may expand that, make that larger, or I might focus or hone that. And both of those things are possible. And I use my altar for that specific purpose. The two functions, or the two ways that we talked about altar constructs, at least in the covenant with the church. Some of this has come down to either it comes down to partnering with something, and that could be a tool or whatnot, right? Something that's going to anchor this to sort of your understanding or experience is working with tarot cards, for example. A lot of people have an attunement with that. There's a partnership that goes on, a conversation that happens between the witch or user and the deck and the person they're reading for, whatever that target might be. That partnership is important to respect. I've had decks in the past with tarot that have just stopped working for a variety of different reasons. And one of those specifically was because it was a disrespected thing, right? So if you're just taking your deck, just throw it on the floor or throw it wherever, it's irreverent, right? Or at least in my experience, it's been irreverent, and tarot decks just stop working. Distance or time away from things often does this too. But partnerships also include our altars. Another way that you might see this lensing and magnifying effect comes from gateways. And gateways, portals, thresholds, that's kind of a pet interest of mine. Oh, it doesn't give me more of that information. It's okay. We'll get back to it. So with the set and setting, we have an idea of partnering with something, creating a gateway or portal, an access point with whatever altar we're working with, whatever tool we're working with. So some of this can be extrapolated to other items as well, not just altars, because altars are their own form of witchcraft tool. So the question becomes, where do you do your witchcraft? This is something that's going to inform you of where you're going to be doing a majority of your witchcraft. Is it going to be a natural setting? Is it going to be an interior setting? Is it an altar? Wherever that is, where are you doing that? How do you store supplies? We have a whole bunch of supplies, right? Our house is just stacked with this stuff. We have hundreds of candles and things of that nature, and herbs and crystals and all sorts of junk. I'm sure most of you do as well. But how do you store that? How do you need to be respectful of that thing? Is it just to keep it so it doesn't break or so it doesn't get lost? How do you store sacred items, right? So not just do you store your supplies for what you're doing, but when they become sacred, say you've done the 3 C's, the cleanse, consecrate, and charging, how do you store those things? How do you keep those or display them? Do they get displayed? Many people, many witches that I know, take those sacred items and they usually end up on altars more often than not. If you are practicing consistently and you're working with a group, probably pretty quickly you're going to run into a problem where you have way too many sacred objects and they can't fit all on your altars. So you're going to have to put them somewhere, right? You can use different containers, shelves, curios. I am a ridiculous fiend for curios. If you put a curio in my path, I will probably put it somewhere, or I will, put it somewhere in my house. It's almost as bad as, witches in boxes or journals that everybody gets. We just buy journals like crazy, and then we just have a whole bunch of them. We don't know what to do with them. But storing our sacred objects, eventually you're going to have to reach into that point. If you have a location that you have them, or a box that they're kept in, consider using sigils. And the same thing can be used on altars as well. Charming a box or something of that nature is a reasonable option. Yes.
So then do you consider curios / boxes to be a form of altars?
No. The reason, possibly. I wouldn't, but I consider them more like shrines. Shrines have more of a dedicated spot versus an altar. And I didn't have shrines listed in here in our conversation. I will get to that in just a second. I'm going to say, is that Butterfree? Butterfry? Doesn't matter. I will read that in just a second. But shrines are an inactive component, right? They may radiate things, they may contain things, but it's not something where I'm going to be doing active work. At least in my definition that I understand it as. An altar has more of a give and take, whereas a shrine is going to be more of a point of reverence, basically. I'm gonna go ahead and read this one out loud. So I want to make sure I have this right. Sacred is what you make it, not what someone else makes it. Except in cases of social agreement that a single object is sacred. Pause there real quick. People can make things sacred. This we'll get into some of our later in this conversation, this sermon. They're also going to talk a little bit about psychometry, and it's going to kind of touch on some of how we can determine if something is sacred. But I would say that sacred can be made by oneself. It can be made by the environment. It could be crafted by somebody else, because if I can make it, then somebody else can make it, right? And it just depends on what purpose it's for. Mixed results, probably, because the intent is not necessarily the same. The correspondences might not be the same. So that may have some variance there. However, if anything is sacred, if somebody says, I'm going to give you a sacred dustpan, the group agreement is just between the two people, the person that has it and the person that's giving it to the receiver, right? So the receiver has to also agree that yes, indeed, this is in fact a sacred dustpan, right? So there does have to be at least some sort of entanglement of opinion or basic truth there. But that is a difficult thing to discern. The skill later on in this will mention or give you some idea of how to determine that. Further from this message, I am not sure I understood the difference between charming and enchanting though. Is it you charm an object, but an area can be enchanted. Neither necessarily sacred though. Correct. I would say that something that is enchanted or charmed could be classified as sacred, arguably, because I'm putting special intent in it. It becomes sacred to me. Sacred has some sort of reverence, specialness about the thing that it is, whether that comes from an entity, a liminal realm, or wherever. It's sort of immaterial. A charm is just something smaller. Think of like charm bracelets, like I said, rings, necklaces, that kind of thing. A smaller object may be enchanted in long term though, and that could become, a charm could likely become something that's enchanted, which would have a long-term component to it. I wouldn't generally charm a house as an example. It just seemed strange, right? It seemed more likely that you would enchant a house. Or if you think back to Wicca and their circles, right? So they have, the sphere, or that, they make a circle, then they cast a circle, then that's usually an energetic sphere, I suppose, above and below oneself, and then they're moving around that, or they're doing things to raise power, and the high priestess is then directing that outward for some purpose, right? That would be an enchanted area. I wouldn't call that a charmed area, right? And so does that sort of help with charmed versus enchanted before I go on? Okay, cool. And they just said it does.
You
Also,
can also like voice as well. Like if you feel more comfortable sending a message, absolutely send the message. But anyone is more than welcome to also like vocally talk within the video as well.
yes. The next question that they had was, are hinges are strong magical flow spaces? Ah, gotcha. Not a problem. So hinges are strong magical, flow spaces. I would say yes. Hinges tend to have some sort of focal point at that same sacred circle. And the easiest one to think of is just Stonehenge, for example. You could make your own hinge. It doesn't have the same sort of history and connection, but it may have a similar connection over time. There seems to be a temporal component or a time component to enchanted spaces, essentially. And your first altar, and the following question is, and the last one is, and your first altar is basically your mental stability. Your first altar is impacted by mental stability. The first altar is the altar of self, the altar of the personal self, physical embodiment of the individual. Your mental stability is going to impact that first altar, right? Since I'm bringing in liminal energy into myself, or liminal magic, if you will, to affect a change. If I'm unstable, it's going to make it very difficult. You can think of this as weak wiring, right? Let's think about this in electrical terms. If I have a conductive wire that's in good condition and isn't frayed, the electricity is going to pass through it. If I have an old wire that's made of, has a fabric and it's been around for 100 years and it's frayed and the wires are sticking out, it's not going to flow as well and it could start a fire. Unintended results for what you're trying to do. And that's where that instability of your external life can impact your first altar. Because if we're not in a healthy space, it's really difficult to get anything done. And that just goes for anything, let alone just witchcraft. It's just important to be aware of those, but witchcraft can help smooth those out or give answers to that. I would still recommend practicing your witchcraft even to a certain point in those states of mind, such as I will focus more on inquiry and asking, and then I will try to get to a point where I can have as quiet of a mind as I possibly can, so I can still be receptive. And that seeking, that introspective seeking with pendulums or runes or whatever tools you're using, can help lead you to answers. Don't force it because you're working against the tide here, right? If you are in an unstable state of mind, it's going to be very difficult to do that. And you might have to step away, and it's okay. Even if you are in the middle of something, just step away. It's not going to explode. You'll be all right. And if it does, then you learn something. More likely than not, it will probably be fine. I have not encountered something along those lines. Does that answer your questions? They followed up with, I think I get it, but I might have a fundamental misunderstanding. I would ask, what is self other than your mental health and stability? But I'll save that for another time for the sake of the sermon. Yeah, your mental stability is part of self. They are inextricably linked. Yes. If I'm embodied, I have a brain, but then we're going to get way derailed into the philosophy of mind, and I had a very difficult time with that class. And yes, we can take that later.
I guess you mean more of self as like your actual physical body.
Yes, but that particular guest is saying that your mental stability and your mental brainness, your you-ness of your brain still exists, because if you have self, then the self identity exists regardless of the body.
Yeah.
And so they're inextricably linked. And then now you see how we would.
Right, yes, we can keep going, of course.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so with that in mind, keep those questions in your head. Basically, where do you do your witchcraft? How do you store your supplies? What do you do with your sacred items? And what do you do with expired materials? Please end your spells. Know when they're done. We have come across this so many times, and that's a great thing to do at altars. That moves us over to furniture and other furnishings, I suppose. I will commonly see witches primarily practice bookshelves, desks, and often on like chest of drawers. Those three seem to be the most common across the majority of witches that I've run into. Not many have a chapel in their house. Not many have dedicated furniture for this, or it's just haphazard of this surface works and we're just gonna make this work with whatever it is. I would argue, or at least I would posit, that it might be important to figure out where you practice. If you're practicing on a random table, you might want to consider some thoughts, such as these two altars behind me. This one is mine, and this one is Gwen's. Here on my, I don't know what direction this is, but this one is Gwen's. What we ran into, both of these pieces of furniture are antiques. We didn't know there would be a response or an impediment to practicing witchcraft on old things that already have a history. That surprised us, which you would think, oh, why would that matter? You would just think it's furniture, it's inert. And usually you're right. Most people don't, spend a lot of time generationally with bookshelves. They don't usually transfer from person to person. These objects, this pipe organ, this used to be a pump organ. And the family that had this, it's been in their family for like 5 generations. And it used to make music, and it's been transitioned to a lot of different objects. This right here used to be I guess, a buffet, or where you store like silverware and that kind of thing. So it was for dining and that stuff originally. Both of them are very old and have a history. We didn't realize that this was going to cause difficulties with what our purpose was. So the purpose that we have for them is obviously for our altars, but that previous history came into play and it just wasn't functioning. With Gwen's, what are some of the things that happened for you? I'm just gesturing. Gwen is over here, by the way, so you know I'm not talking to you at all.
Just the disembodied voice. Honest for mine, I like things just kept breaking. Like literally things just kept flying off of my altar and like shattering on the floor. Because it has never been an altar. I guess I can't fully state that it's never been an altar before because I don't actually know. But more likely than not, it's never been a pagan altar before. And it didn't know what to do with it, and I don't think it fully liked it. And so literally several things just flew off of there and shattered.
And I'll get to the resolution of
Right.
that. But
yeah, that's what would happen for me. And then for personally for me, it was hard to connect. Like I couldn't do magic. I couldn't even concentrate standing there. And then it didn't also help with having things break at my altar. It was very disconnected. I couldn't raise up energy. I couldn't even like sit and do a simple prayer. Like it was very hard to do just even the basics of magic at my altar.
Right. And then for me, this didn't connect to the celestial like at all. It just felt like it was just in a dark void that wasn't connected to anything. And so like I'm like, I put the altar in. I'm gonna go ahead and connect to the celestial like I normally do. That didn't work. Because it just frankly wasn't anywhere, metaphysically speaking. It was something else entirely and has a mixture of purposes in its history. And so that caused some of this sort of just miasma, I guess, be the best way to describe that as. And then I realized that that was a difficulty. In Gwen's resolution of altar stuff, they both work fine now, just as a side note. I'm not done with mine yet, but it's prepared. I'll talk about that in just a second. But with Gwen's approach, she decided to partner with hers. And I'll let you describe that now because that'll probably be easier than me trying to describe your partnership.
Yeah, I basically just kind of decided to talk to it and tell it what it was now. And so I just kind of told it that it was a pagan altar. I described all the things that was on it. I described the things that was in it. I described like specific candles and what they were used for. I described specific tools and what they were used for. And I took the time to like literally like spell out everything that I use in my practice every day, basically. And I just kind of like talked to it and let it know what was going on because I think it was just very confused about what was going on. And so now every morning I greet it, I say good morning, I say thank you at the end of my prayers in the morning or at the end of my spells or whatever I use at it. And it's more of a partnership where I've never, because right, like how he was saying earlier, I've never had a piece of furniture that had this previous energy beforehand or this previous personality beforehand. And so I treat it as it has energy and it has a personality. And so that's why I think it, tell it good morning and all that kind of stuff. And so now everything works fine. I'm able to do tarot readings because that was another thing too. I couldn't even do tarot readings on it. Nothing made sense. And so now I do tarot readings, I do my blessings, I'll do energy work on it, all that kind of stuff. And now it works a lot better.
So that's one of the ways that partnerships can be used. So I mentioned partnerships and gateways before. In Gwen's instance, that was a partnership, continues to be a partnership. This again can be extrapolated to other tools also. For me, this is more of a gateway. So I use it as an access point to something, right? I'm seeking access to the celestial liminal space. It is prepared. I am not prepared. And the reason I say that is that there's a secondary spell that I need to do with this. First, it was a programming aspect to it, right? So I channeled my magic through through the altar itself, and then just got it familiar with that identity. And once that was familiar, I prayed at it and worked with it, mostly just to inform it as a gateway, basically, and start preparing it for that access. When that happened, there was, and I didn't know really what I was doing. There was a sort of, it's just experiential sort of learning. After about a week and a half or so, the imagery that I got, this is similar, when I say imagery, it's a vision. Think of it kind of along the lines of scrying, right? When you scribe or something, you get a vision, or you get something in your mind's eye, or you get some sort of sensory something happening, right? To inform you of some sort of message. In my instance, I do have visual constructs, I suppose you could say, and with that, it changed from one symbol to another symbol, almost like it was targeting, and it was like, it was a lock. And I knew then it was like, I'm ready and attenuated for this work, right? And so now it's ready to be that. I, however, have not yet been in the state or in this ability yet to finalize that gateway. And so I've been working with it to continue that formality of that gateway construct, as well as trying to continue to familiarize and also connect to that altar. And it's ready, but I can tell that it's really itching to do it. I just need to put the time aside to do it, but not yet, because I'm still dealing with tangled nest stuff. There's a whole host of things that are happening for me right now in my life that just, it's not time yet for me. So I am just maintaining its readiness or its prepared state for when I'm ready to do the follow through and connect. But I will tell you, it is definitely gnawing at me consistently to do so. And it is something that is in the back of my head all the time, that it needs to be done so that the gateway can be opened and I can do the celestial work that I need to. And there is definitely some disconnect. So right now, because I don't have the access point for that lensing, that magnifying aspect, I'm not doing as much witchcraft as I normally would be doing, right? Because it's not, I don't have that connection. I don't have that restorative piece. There's not a feedback conversation between the liminal realm that I work with and my physical first altar. These two things are not connected. And because of that reason, I'm not in a state to do larger workings right now. And that's part of the reason why this is just gnawing at my mind, because of the reason that I want to be doing these other things, but this is the first step for me. And so again, we prepared these in very different ways. These two altars are prepared in very different manners, right? A lot of people are just going to work with whatever they have, but I would encourage strongly, have some furniture. I don't necessarily mean really large, because some environments are not available. Some things have to be more private. Boxes work. Just have the intent behind whatever it is you are doing with it, so that it's available for you, whatever size that is. And if it's not something physical, maybe it's something natural, and you go and hike to the thing. Traveling altars is one that came up just now in the comments. Traveling altars for me, this is the black witch box that I wander around with when I leave my house, and it usually has a bunch of objects in it that I need for various purposes. You don't have to go this extreme. This box is a little bit ridiculous for just traveling around, especially if I try this on a plane, it's going to be a little difficult. So to that end,
I was like, you want to grab mine? That's my traveling altar box.
something that's not closed.
Oh, sorry.
This is another traveling altar box as well, just small wooden, right? There's a little latch on the front, and then this can be a host of various objects that you need as well. In terms of even smaller, I wonder if I can reach this one. The one that usually comes with me on travel is this. It's a small, I got this actually as a birthday gift. So split the sky on that. Anyways, this is just a zippered soft bag, and this has a smaller crystal orb in it for obsidian that I use. There's some oracle cards in here. There's pendulum stuff, you know, some like incense lighters, that sort of thing, depending if you're traveling. If you're traveling on a plane, don't take a lighter on the plane. Just be safe And don't be, think of it before you put it on in a bag, just so you know. But something small like this is also effective. I've seen Altoid tins. I'm sure you know what those are. They're small metal tins. You can also buy these online that don't have any markings on them, and that is an option. Some of the others as well. So you can really adapt this as you need. At one point in time, I forgot, I brought a crystal with me. Actually, it's that one down here, this white one in the lower corner there. I forgot the stand and I went to the hotel and I was like, what am I gonna do? And I just grabbed one of the paper cups and I just stuck it on top of that thing. And that was the crystal ball stand because that's what I had. So you kind of have to get a little inventive with that because you're not gonna have as many objects. I really, the small things that I need is that I would like some sort of cloth to kneel on, a candle, my smaller obsidian orb, but it's going to be different from witch to witch, what they need and what they require. So those are some of those ideas that may help with the altars themselves. There are definitely some practices that don't have any altars. They don't even use them. It doesn't exist. And that's also totally reasonable. Again, that kind of lends more towards the natural side of things as well. You may also want to consider your security while doing this. If you're in a park because you don't have an altar and you're just hanging out doing witchcraft or doing spells, it might not be the best place to do that because things, there's some privacy here that you might want to consider ahead of time. Those are less common. I would find forests, like natural forest, that kind of thing, where you would just first camp. That's basically just somewhere in a natural forest, like a nature preserve or a park or something along those lines. Go there, and there's often a lot of privacy that you can get to. Become familiar with it, especially if you don't have a physical altar and it's mostly just natural. There's another witch that I know that their altar is just parent nature, but it's elementally based, and so they will hike for like weeks into a place, and then they will go do their practice like at a lake or a mountain that they go to or they're traversing to. And that's also another approach to altars as well, similar to like hinges and that sort of thing. So the new altar topics also compatibility and incompatibility. So there is a sort of resonance that happens with objects that you're using, specifically altars. Some of them will work, some of them won't work, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to work forever. My altar may very well just stop working at some point or be insufficient for my practice. That can happen. So be prepared for changes in how your practice feels and be aware of your own, how that feels internally, whether or not things stop working as you expect them to, or things become more difficult, or you feel more disconnected. Those are surefire signs something is amiss, whether or not you need to repair with the altar or whether or not you need a new one entirely. It's going to vary widely. Also consider the law of contagion. The law of contagion is that when two objects are in close proximity, it creates a link until this thing is severed. So very much this altar and the other altar are in the law of contagion. The things that were around those for all the years that they've been in existence as the functional objects they are, have some residual energy or magic or experience to them. The house that we're living in, and this chapel is also connected to, is from over 100 years ago. So this thing is old and it's definitely can be cantankerous. Not to us so far, but definitely considering what those residual magic will kind of do, those kinds of resonances that came before. This is where we get into some of what the previous question was, that we talk about psychometry. I was very fascinated by what the research was that I did on this. The original term from psychometry itself, psychometry, psychometry. It was popularized in the 19th century, arguably by the seances and all the occult societies that existed in Victorian time because of their obsession with death. That was last sermon. But psychometry was actually apparently coined by a geologist. And I was like, why a geologist? I thought that was very strange. That specific geologist is actually one of the Buchanans, Joseph Rhodes Buchanan, 1842, had used psychometry. And it was also in the book later by one of his followers called Measuring the Soul, and it was talking about psychometry. Now, there is no scientific basis of this. There are experiments everywhere about this. You could go do your own research. I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. But basically, Joseph Rhodes Buchanan about psychometry said that there are mental fossils for psychologists. It portrays the human beings who have roamed over its surface in the shadows and the darkness of primeval barbarism. A whole bunch of words there. But the mental fossils, that is where I was like, that's a fascinating connection. Caption language. So this psychometry from a geologist makes sense because it was the fossils that you would find in archaeology, in geological records, that they were comparing that to the mental fossils, basically. Very fascinating. His follower after that also was another well-known geologist, which also was very strange, that there was more than one geologist that really went down this rabbit hole of psychometry. These two people really started that kind of thing, and I kind of got stuck on this because the definition said that there was an accurate understanding of factual information from objects, and that's what didn't sit well with me, and I want to know exactly what that was. So what psychometry is contact with a target that reveals impressions and or facts. So psychometry is contact with a target, reveals impressions and or facts. You might not think that you're doing this, but think of all the times you've used a pendulum or you've tried to use witchcraft to discern information about something. It's in the same vein as psychometry, right? Responses that you might have to objects or tools or other areas or those kinds of things are all in that realm of essentially extrasensory perception, but more specifically psychometry. So objects such as these altars and any altars that you're using, especially if they have history, psychometry can play a role in developing an understanding of what the history of that object is. And using things like pendulums and tarot and runes and other occult technologies can help you inform what's going on with whatever object that is. The same thing holds true for people who you might suspect. I'm not saying everybody is, nor am I going to get into this long lengthy thing, but possessions, for example, that is another way that you can sort of tell. It's about contact with something that gives you information, impressions, or facts, and is not relegated to only linear time. This can also be future, past, or present. It really doesn't, it is a wild field and there's a lot of information about it. I know that there is some contact with things that I just have a sense about. Gwen had an experience with an object that we found, and that is also on the same level of psychometry. Do you remember which object I'm talking about?
The mirror.
The mirror. Mm-hmm. Do you want to explain that mirror?
Sure. I picked up like a really old like metal mirror and immediately had like a negative reaction to it and like had to put it down. We were theorizing it during our coven of like maybe it was just like a reaction to like the metal itself because I was like, ooh, this is haunted. But like maybe just like possibly haunted, possibly just like the energies of the metal itself conflicting with the energies of me kind of a thing. But
Right.
yes, like having an like immediate negative reaction to picking up a metal, very old hand mirror.
Yeah.
Hand mirror.
Psychometry also comes into play when we have the experience of haunted places or places that we feel are haunted. We can get into some really crazy pseudoscience here. We start going off on tangent about, you know, the different hertz of sound, and some of the theories behind that is we have a certain frequency that are whom we evolved from have some response to a certain vibrational frequency. And the reason being is that they sheltered in caves and they need to know that frequency to escape if there was going to be a cave collapse. That same frequency just so happens to be in many of these purported haunted locations have the same sonic frequency that exists that causes this sort of unease or this dysregulation. Do what you will with that information. I cannot confirm or deny doing on research, but the same thing being is that this psychometry is a way for us to sense objects and their history and our responses to them. It borders a little bit onto our own intuition about things, or you might call it a gut feeling, You may get gut feelings from certain things or certain people. It's not just objects. It is literally anything in your environment, and you can work on this. Our awareness of these two things really just came from experience of the objects that we were trying to use, and that they just didn't function, and we could feel that that didn't function. That is a form of psychometry to tell us about these objects and what they mean. A whole range of other skills comes into play, specifically my claircognizance, which is not necessarily directable, but shows up. Claircognizance is clear knowing. And so I know things that need to happen or when they're supposed to happen, but it's not necessarily related to linear time. And so when I'm getting a psychometric sort of reading from an object like this altar, I have a claircognizant understanding of what needs to happen. Nobody told me I needed to make this a gateway. It is based on that psychometric understanding, that experience, and then my own claircognizance of what needs to happen. I would then probably jump over to aneromancy, the dream divination sort of stuff, and start trying to figure out what it is in my subconscious that's informing me of this, because messages come through pretty clearly there. All right, sounds good. Thanks for being here. One of our guests is going to be exiting, and they will follow up later because all of these are recorded and placed on our YouTube. The craze of the psychometric sort of feelings had to do with the seances and that sort of things, because trance or altered consciousness states may assist psychometry. So a lowered consciousness or less active consciousness. This goes back to our tangled nest. If I'm anxious and I have all this stuff in my head, I can't understand these other pieces. Is it an altered form consciousness? Maybe, because I'm clarifying myself. Maybe. And finally, in conclusion, I'm a little over, but thank you for sticking with me on this one. Consider how and where you connect to liminal realms, whatever that might be, whether it's natural, whether it's infernal, whether it's celestial, I don't care, but understand where that comes from. Use that understanding, that gut feeling, that psychometry, to understand what you're doing with that. If you have specific furniture for your altar, maybe figure out what the whole story is about that thing. It's a great way to practice. You need to assess your own sacred spaces and mind, the waxing and waning components of that. Balancing your first altar and its own state. So that state of mind and my own physicality. If I'm sick, I'm probably not going to be practicing witchcraft because I'm not well enough to do so. Channeling that is just going to cause incongruencies. Other altar constructs are important to think of. The set and setting, the furniture that you're using, not just a random bookshelf that you found on some random side street, unless that makes sense for you, but follow your instincts about that. The set and setting is important for your privacy, for your peace of mind when you're doing that. You know, it's not everywhere is going to be appropriate to perform your witchcraft. And so just be cognizant of that when you practice. We sort of just kind of know this, but bring that more to your consciousness. And this will also help other aspects of your witchcraft. The psychometry and the law of contagion, psychometry, that connection to objects and knowing what their history is and discerning those facts and impressions is really important. And that law of contagion has to do with that connected link. When two things are connected together, there's usually a link. People's hairbrushes, for example, rings that somebody wears consistently, inadvertently can become imbued with some of their own personality, and they may not necessarily work for you in the way that you expect. This is why we have the 3 C's for cleansing, consecrating, and charging, in case we are working with an older object, in case that psychometry is telling you this isn't going to be appropriate to use, or this doesn't work the way you think it's going to work. So then we can use those tools. One of my other coven members brings up a really interesting point about draining an object instead of cleanse, consecrate, and charge, or as part of that makeup of basically draining all the energy out of it, kind of like a battery, and then placing your own energy into it, was another interesting approach that I had a lot of experience with, but definitely will be working on that. And from there, that's what I have for altars on part 2 for that. Any questions or comments about this? Well, if you do have any questions, you can always email us. Our website has a contact form on it, churchofwitchcraft.org. It also has a host of other links to our YouTube channels. This sermon, all of our sermons are going to be uploaded and are there now. for you to view and look on. You can comment on that as well. And you're absolutely welcome. Pocket Jen, I believe is what the name was. And if you want to talk to us or you have more questions, you want to explore this more in depth, we are very much available for that. Please visit us. You can find information for our meetups on our Facebook, Discord, and Meetup, as well as our website calendar. Otherwise, thank you for being here and have a great evening.